Welcome back to another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Richard Thompson. Today, I am joined by Vicky Little, nationally recognised neuroinclusion specialist and one of Australia's leading voices in neurodiversity within the workplace. With over 20 years experience and partnerships across over 500 organisations, Vicky brings both lived experience and deep expertise to this conversation. In this episode, we unpack neurodivergence, late diagnosis, workplace barriers, and how leaders can build truly inclusive environments. Whether you're a business owner, leader, or simply curious, this conversation is for you. All right, let's get into it. Vicky Little, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
You are a thought leader when it comes to neurodivergence, particularly in the workplace. And I'll preface this by saying I have very little understanding, experience, awareness of neurodivergence generally. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really excited about learning as much as I can, sponging as much as I can from you, for someone who's been in it for so long. Has there been a general rise in the population who manage with neurodivergence, mm-hmm. or is it simply because we are becoming a society that is more accepting of that sort of mm-hmm. condition or experience?
Great. It's a great first question. There's many factors. I think we are seeing a rise because the diagnostic criteria is broadening. We're learning more about, for example, the experience for females and women and how all types of, all neurotypes can show up differently for women. Whereas previously, for example, the autism spectrum diagnosis criteria was largely defined by the experience for males. And so we saw, a much higher prevalence of males to females. But actually now with research, understanding, we are seeing that there needs to be a broadening in the diagnostic criteria to bring in the fold of the female experience and how it manifests for women. So that's one of the factors, which has been a really exciting shift, particularly in all neurotypes, but we're learning more about ADHD, and there's been a huge increase in terms of understanding and prevalence in ADHD for women, and so now we're learning so much more about how ADHD, for example, can look and feel different for women. We'll get more into that as we go through, but I think also we've got more recognition of different neurotypes. We're getting more understanding of the individual experience. And I think there's definitely just more language. There's more understanding of our brains, how they work, how we process information, and how that shows up in the workplace, but also in education. So I think just with the rise of access to information, and particularly for Gen Z, there's a huge increase in terms of Gen Z and how they identify or self-identify. And so we're seeing, for example, that I think it's 53% of Gen Z identifying as being neurodivergent. And so just with that, I think that's a reflection of the language, the access to information, and just more understanding of our brains and how they work, as well as the increase in research in adults. And like I said, increase understanding of how it presents in women.
For those listening, who obviously the phrase neurodivergence is ever prevalent, but what is it exactly? How do you define that for yourself? What are we actually dealing with when we talk about a neurodivergent person?
Yes, so neurodivergence is the natural variation in the human brain, and so it is the diversity of thought, it's diversity of how our brains process, like I said. And so with that in mind, it's how our brains are wired. And many of those natural variations we call neurotypes or conditions, ADHD, autism, like I mentioned, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette syndrome. There's the umbrella of neurodiversity encompasses many neurotypes. But yes, it's largely just how our brains are wired. And that is all humans, because every brain is wired slightly differently. But what it brings to life. And I love the word neurodiversity because it's a celebratory word. It celebrates that all humans are different and our brains, rightly so, wired in different ways to bring different perspectives, different insights, different talents, different, ways of thinking that celebrates the evolution of the human experience. And so I think where we come into play is understanding it more within the workplace context because we are, like neurodiversity is all humans, all brains, and so therefore workplaces, organisations have a role to play in understanding the neurodivergence and their neurodivergent employees and how to support them as individuals.
You've been documented, or you document yourself, that you've had a late diagnosis. This is just, I guess, for someone who has been in the space for so long, talk to me through that experience, that journey for you, because I would imagine that, like others who receive a diagnosis of being neurodivergent, there must be some relief, or I'll be interested to know your emotional response to that diagnosis.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's so I've been working in this space for about 20 years and I got my diagnosis only a year and a half ago or so. But I knew, I felt it was time to look into it further around the time of COVID, where I describe sometimes that particularly for women, there's periods in our life where there becomes a spilling over of the ADHD or the neurodivergence. And for me, the COVID lockdowns, for example, I'm based in Sydney, so in New South Wales we had quite significant lockdowns. And so all humans at that point were stripped away, I think, of our routine, our structures, our support systems, our community, and obviously everyone, for the majority, had to work from home. And so I had young children. I had my daughter was only 6 months old and I had a 3-year-old. And so I think it was then that suddenly, and obviously we were living in it was a very stressful time. And so for many it was, heightened anxiety and, a huge impact on mental health in general. And I think for me at that time, it sort of started to shift the foundations a little bit. And then, there was just a periods of a lot of loss. I went through some quite significant grief and huge changes in my life. And then the ADHD just came spilling over. And it was just, it could be something of those, it doesn't have to be that monumental. For many women, it's hormonal changes. So it could be having children, menopause, of which then what I believe is happening is that we are no longer able to mask or camouflage, which is a tool or a coping mechanism for many. Most neurodivergent women particularly are known to use that or use that without knowing as a way to hide any particular challenges. Mimicking others is a common way to camouflage or mask for autistic women, for example. And for me, I didn't really know that I was doing that to a certain extent. It is just your way of moving through the world. And for me, I wouldn't say that I had significant barriers that came about from my ADHD. I think it's actually just driven, for me, my passion and my drive for what is my main passion, which is this work. So I'm lucky that in the end it turned out that I was working in the space that is my passion. So for me, I would describe it as the puzzle pieces coming together. There was clear things that I found more challenging than others that I would never think was much of anything. I would just get on with it. That could be anything from schoolwork. Like at high school, I had to work extra hard. I had challenges processing what was being said verbally. And so when it came to those more senior years at school, I remember just having to rewrite everything and then highlight and then so the process for me, I had a really great process clearly, but it was almost now in hindsight, it was double the amount of work that everyone else was doing. And I knew that I was working extra hard, but I didn't know why. I just knew I needed to process it in the way that was working for me. So that in hindsight was, but I just found a way to get around that, as we do. And I think that's neurodivergent individuals have always just found a way to get around the systems that are set. So that's, an education example. And then in the workplace, you just find a way to work within the processes that exist, or they create significant barriers. So that's where, challenges to finding work, the interview and the processes that come into play there, and how neurotypical they are, and how incredibly, how significant the barrier is to many to get through the interview process. And then in the workplace, the process that exists in regards to how we're assessed in regards to our performance, the sort of social rules that are created within the workplace, they all create quite a lot of significant barriers. So for me, that's my journey of getting a late diagnosis, and it's been eye-opening and really added to my depth of understanding in terms of what it's meant for me as a leader particularly, and understanding not just the challenges, but what needs to shift in terms of what the workplaces need to understand and shift to create a more inclusive workplace. And then, for me, then my son also got his diagnosis. So for me, the drive was I could see it coming for him, and I wanted to go first. And I wanted to create a house that was neuroaffirming. And so then by the time I had my diagnosis, we'd spoken about it quite a lot, explained how my brain works. And then he got his diagnosis, and it was a celebration then for him to have his ADHD diagnosis as well. So then that's created a real space where he's learning about his brain in that really sort of positive and neuroaffirming way.
You worked with over 500 organisations in this space, and you referenced the challenges that organisational leaders have. What are the biggest hurdles at the moment to have that acceptance or have that understanding?
It's a big question. We don't realise it, but the way in which the workplace is set is based on, like I said before, neurotypical processes or neurotypical norms. For example, pre-COVID, each workplace probably had varying degrees of the equivalent, particularly in the Australian workplace, Friday afternoon drinks, or some sort of a social gathering that was not obviously in the job description, but it certainly was a hidden rule or
Expectation.
Yeah, of how you should show that you're part of the team. Now, for autistic individuals, for example, everyone is different, but for the most part, those social environments are exhausting because it takes extra work, because it's understanding the body language of how learning the art of small talk and the nonverbal communication, all of that is a skill that has to be learned. It's not innate necessarily in an autistic person. And so it's just an extra skill. It can be learned. I've met so many autistic people who are exceptional communicators, exceptional social skills, very funny. So, but all of that has taken extra work to learn potentially for that person. And so you can imagine then the extra work that goes into being in that social environment. And so the social battery varies from person to person. So you might be somebody who really thrives off being around others and gets a lot from those sort of social engagements. And so therefore, it takes a while for your social battery to be full, or your social cup. Whereas for an autistic person, like I just described, it may not take long. It might be, 15, 30 minutes at an event like that, and then you are full and spent, and then it becomes overwhelming and exhausting. I think pre-COVID we used to have these expectations that we'd operate in this sort of social workplace. It's the water cooler conversations, it's the small talk in the lift, it's the the chats about what was on TV last night. And I think they are all extra work. And there's one incredible woman who I know really well, an autistic woman, and she once described it as, when you start a job, you learn the essential criteria of the job, the technical skills for the job. And obviously you're learning about the team, and you're learning about the ins and outs of that culture of that workplace that you've just started to work at. But on top of that, for an autistic person, it is an entire other job to learn the social etiquette. Yes, that's right. And how to move through the nonverbal communication, the small talk, the ins and outs of team meetings, and how you move through that.
I would have thought that it'd be the same for everybody, but perhaps for someone who is autistic, which would, without my understanding, would be one very, very far end of the spectrum, it would probably take more of a conscious effort. to understand. Because I think going into any new environment, everyone's assessing the reading the room
Of
and
course.
working out who's the leader, who's the lead, who's how to have the conversations.
Yes. So, but the difference is for an autistic person in that scenario, it is a constant assessment of the movements of others, the energy, the what's being said. So, for example, a spontaneous conversation happens in an open plan office about what was on TV last night. So everyone's talking about MasterChef. Suddenly everyone's talking about MasterChef. They've turned away from their computers. They are talking about it. Everyone's jumping in. That is a conversation. That entire scenario is harder for an autistic person to navigate. So they're thinking ahead about what to say, waiting for a pause in conversation that may never come because everyone's having a good old chat. And then all of a sudden, everyone just turns around and goes back to the desk and the conversation's over. And so it's the reading of that entire conversation that perhaps someone who is neurotypical, who's not neurodivergent, might just be able to sort of naturally read that and be like, okay, well, it's time to go back. But you can already see from all those extra thought processes and anticipation and anxiety about wanting to contribute, wanting to be part of the conversation, and then suddenly everyone just decides without words that they're going to go back to their work now. And it's like that all the time. So it is incredibly difficult for neurodivergent individuals to move through the social landscape of the workplace. It is an extra job, more so than somebody who, yes, of course, anybody who has just started a new job, 3 to 6 months, you're wanting to make a good impression, you're wanting to learn the ins and outs, but it is almost like a natural part of you, and naturally you become quite comfortable. It is essential for neurodivergent individuals to learn that, and it takes double, if not more, extra work than a neurotypical person.
So then, and I still have, there's so many questions in my head, which we'll get to. But principally, what is utopia then? I'm very in the workplace. I'm very intrigued, and I want to get into the concept of the spectrum. And I think it's it's very simple to say if we had a autistic employee, I'm intrigued to know what the process is there as an employer, as an organization. If you had I feel, again, I don't have any experience or research about it, but I would have thought that is a different, and perhaps it's not, but that seems to be a more formal and very, very conscious decision and awareness of an employee who manages with autism, as against perhaps the employees that are on the other side of the spectrum who still process differently than everyone else, but perhaps not as severe as their autistic counterparts.
Right.
So the first question, I guess, Vicky, is how, as an employer, as an organisation, you talk about the conversation about the TV show and things. How as an employer, as an organisation, how do we support that?
Right. So I think, and that adds to the other question, is what are the misconceptions? I think the assumption that everybody is the same in the workplace needs to be put out the window in terms of how our brains work.
I think that has to be accepted. Right? That has to be accepted. That diagnosis or not, everyone has the ability to. Everyone has a different way of learning and absorbing and managing. And
that could be a neurotype. It could be a lifelong condition that impacts you throughout your daily working life, your relationships, as we're talking about. It could also be, and they're all hidden, by the way, so non-visible challenges. So as a leader, you're not to know necessarily unless someone feels safe to disclose, which is a whole other topic. You're not to know what someone's going through. And then as, you know, it could be seasonal. So once again, grief creates significant cognitive impairment for short periods of time. It is obviously not lifelong, but sleep challenges, sleep apnea also temporarily disrupts your way of being able to move through the world. And so as a leader, back to your question, we need to be leaning into not making assumptions. We need to lean into learning about the individual, what's going on for them in that, obviously that day, that week, that season. and remove misconceptions that everybody's brain works the same, as you say. Like we have to get to that point, because many leaders are still working under the assumption that because I've nodded and heard and not nodding to what you're saying, I have heard what you've said, I've processed, and I'm going to go away and do exactly what you've told me to do because I've shown you that I'm nodding and I'm listening. But for a neurodivergent person who is masking, who is desperately trying to do well in that job, verbal processing, like I said before, for me, as an example, is hard. It's hard for many. So the hearing of what you said may not translate to me exactly understanding. For many, it might mean going away and trying to figure it out, putting in the extra work once again to figure out what, you're supposed to go away and do. Incredible detail focus, so might go into the detail too far or be exceptional in the work that they present back, but it's taken doubly as long. So for leaders, it's being better communicators, being better in the way that and naturally supposed to be a good leader, so being empathetic, a good communicator, and leaning into the fact that human-centered support and supervision is critical. So, as you said, it's about being a good human. Then what is your goal as a leader? Could you, on a daily basis, make small changes, little changes that will make a big difference to you just being naturally more inclusive, regardless of whether you know what someone's going through?
I like that. It's human first. It's individualized.
Exactly.
It's understanding.
Yes.
As I said, from the beginning, it's to understand that everyone thinks differently.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
That should be celebrated for sure.
And that brings into the fold, like I said, so many other aspects of the human experience. It could be mental health. It could be anything. And so you as a leader, we need to remove the assumptions that we're always going to know, because we're not. Because most people won't feel safe to tell you what's going on unless you've created a trusting relationship and built that psychological safety.
But even still, with psychological safety, there's no guarantee that that person will have the capability within themselves, within their own brain, to have those conversations.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the spectrum. I can't explain to you how incompetent I am in relation to this topic. So I'm a sponge here. Is it fair to say autism in the neurodivergent spectrum is on one side of the ledger as the most extreme case scenario?
Oh, that's a big sweeping statement.
Someone who doesn't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's...
Well, how do you describe the spectrum? And are we all on it?
No. So autism spectrum disorder, by definition and by diagnostic criteria, does have different levels. But what I think we need to demystify is that there's clearly defined levels in regards to how that person presents. I actually think we need to move away from labels entirely. Labels are important and serve a purpose, yes, for, like I said before, for me, that label really served a purpose in putting the puzzle pieces together. It's helped me be a better leader. It's helped me understand my brain. So that label was important for me.
Why? If you come with the preconception that everyone's wired differently and you are no exception to that, why did you need a label?
I was reaching the point where the challenges that it came about for me were, like I said, it came spilling over. It was tipping me too far the other way. So the challenges for me lie within fatigue, burnout, overwhelm. And so I can't tell you how many fatigue-related conditions I've been diagnosed with over the years.
Yeah.
And it turns out that is a consequence of being an ADHDer.
But those are symptoms are the same, irrespective of the diagnosis or not. So what was it about the label that gave you solace?
I was able to, it took a while, but in putting the pieces of the puzzle together, I realized that it wasn't my fault. So there's so much shame that comes from being an undiagnosed neurodivergent person. You think you're different, and that difference is bad.
Are we trying to accept that everyone's different?
Yeah.
So then why is there the shame?
Because society to that point has said you must fit within this box and you must be operating within this way of working, for example. Otherwise you are considered different. And I'm talking about, obviously the generations, we're creating change for the future, but we've still got so many challenges to go. So, for example, Pre-COVID, 75% of autistic women needed to work part-time because of the fatigue that comes from, what I explained before in terms of understanding the fatigue that comes from masking all the time, the fatigue that comes from just the sensory experience of being in the workplace and traveling on public transport to get to the workplace. Whereas now, since COVID, one of the silver linings has been that more autistic women are able to work full-time. And so...
Why?
Because we've brought in universal design, the concept of working from home, realizing that works for many. If they are able to perform their essential, the inherent requirements of the job from home, then working from home has become more of a universal option for all humans. So, 20 years ago when I first started working in this space, asking for a work from home adjustment was honestly, it was like we were asking to move a physical office to another location.
To your house,
it took so long. It took layer upon layer of approvals. And meanwhile, that person that we were trying to do it for was suffering because the impact of being in the office was so impactful and painful. So, for example, sensory sensitivities is part of the experience of being neurodivergent for many, particularly for autistic individuals, ADHD is for many. But it's known that for some, the sensory overwhelm of an environment, it could be light, it could be sound, it could be touch, can be physically painful. So then when you start to think about that sensory stimuli causing physical pain, we start to understand it more if you're, from a neurodivergent, for a neurotypical perspective. But it's always been that painful for autistic people, for example, to move through the world. We just don't speak about it. We haven't known about, there's been more recognition of it, I suppose, and more awareness. And with that awareness, then we can start to realise the huge impact of things like travelling to work on public transport, the smells, the sounds, the delays, the intense number of people. And so bringing it back, it's the impact of being neurodivergent in the workplace can have various consequences. And like I said, for me, it was, the fatigue and the burnout. I was really lucky to facilitate we run a neurodivergent leader series. So leaders who are trying to learn the skills about, who are neurodivergent and wanting to learn skills to be operating in a neurotypical workplace almost, or just, finding a community where we can learn from each other about being authentic. Many of the women in that group, female neurodivergent leaders, said that they could almost schedule in the burnout, like almost put it in their diary every quarter. And that to me is a systemic issue. That's an indicator that our systems and our processes are not set up to support the experience of being neurodivergent. We are still working overtime and working doubly as hard. Sometimes that's a strength. That's just how we work. But we are still chasing and trying to fit within the systems and processes that are designed for neurotypical people.
If we're talking about the brain and the synapses and the difference in the cognition between neurodivergent and everyone else.
Yep.
Is it a diagnostic test? Is it something that we can see with certainty that patient A, there is something that's going on in the brain diagnostically that impacts, that is the result of it, or is it more of a subjective assessment?
There's definite clear criteria that has to be met, but in terms of the brain, and look, I'm not going to comment too much on this because there is neuroscientists who study this and there's incredible research, but all you need to see is an image of an autistic brain versus a neurotypical brain to see that there's, as you mentioned, the synapses, there is more going on in the autistic brain than is in the neurotypical brain. And it's fascinating. And what that lends itself to show us is that it's something that can be, that we know is happening within the neurodivergent brain, but there is more being taken in terms of sensory stimuli. There is more, the brain is constantly taking in more stimuli from the world around it. There is a common misconception that, for example, autistic people don't understand others, so perhaps might lack theory of mind or may have decreased empathy, but actually, I think the opposite is true.
It's true, yeah.
I think that autistic people have incredible amounts of empathy and understanding of the human, and actually have a stronger feeling of the energy of others around them. And as a result, because it is so overwhelming, as indicated by the brain imagery, that then use strategies to, create spaces where they don't need to be around, that social situation is so exhausting, for example, that then perhaps, need more of a job, for example, where they can work from home and manage that, or, so, but yeah, in terms of the diagnostic criteria, it's very much set in terms of, but there is a range, obviously, within that diagnostic process. Like I said, I'm not a diagnostician, but all I know is that research is definitely playing into and will continue to evolve and then we'll, improve the way in which we're diagnosing and being able to anticipate diagnosis.
Yeah, I appreciate you're an organisational specialist with and managing or assisting organisations with neurodivergent employees. So a couple of these questions are probably for my own understanding, and not necessarily medical, and knowing that you're not that way, that experience. But you talked about how in your own experience there were mitigating factors that occurred that you overspilled and that led you to going down the path of being diagnosed with ADHD. And a lot of the traits that I'm hearing, a lot of the symptoms or the things that you're managing are otherwise human experiences as well. The anxiety, the overwhelm, the burnout. My question leads to whether this is a nurture or nature. Whether the people as neurodivergent people, is it a nurture or nature position? Did you have these is it the position that you had these traits your entire life and your environment kept them under control, or because of these events that occurred that it tipped you over the edge, for example, and then you have that diagnosis? And then second to that, these adults who are finding so much solace in the diagnosis, so much strength in a diagnosis to say I'm thankful that's the position. If that's been later in life that they started those symptoms, is it something that they can could they potentially reverse engineer that and have the skill set within themselves and get off that neurodivergent positioning?
Once again, that's not necessarily something I'm an expert in terms of research and diagnosis, but what we do know in terms of nature versus nurture is that neurodivergence is hereditary. What percentage is, there's still so much more to be done. There's no yet clear environmental link for autism, for example. So I would say mostly you can look at the family to see where that neurodivergence stems from. In terms of can it be reversed, we're talking about lifelong conditions, the developmental conditions. So I believe neurodivergent people are exceptional and can learn any skill if they put their mind to it, particularly if it's something that they're passionate about. We have interest-based nervous systems. And so if your passion, for example, was to become more social, and that was something that was really of interest to you, then I believe, like I said, I've met many autistic people who have learnt that skill, learnt from watching TV shows, how people, body gestures, nonverbal communication, how people make others laugh, so that is a skill that can be learned, just like any other skill that allows people to learn skills to manage better in certain situations. It doesn't take away the developmental condition that is their neurodivergence. It means that they are learning skills to move through the world. And like I said, for some, that could be, it varies from person to person on what that looks like. But I believe we find, like all humans, find ways to cope with things that we find hard. But for neurodivergent individuals, those coping mechanisms can mean the difference between participating in the workplace, for example, and not. Whereas for a neurotypical person, it could just mean, challenges that don't impact on a daily life as much and don't create barriers necessarily to access work, to retain work. So for me, I think it's partly up to neurodivergent individuals to learn skills required, to move through the world, yes. And like I said, I've learned plenty of skills to move through the world. I've also just become better at explaining how my brain works. So I'm known for interrupting people during conversation. I now know that that's a part of my ADHD. Before, I just thought I was just someone who interrupted people a lot. So that's a really small example, really not too impactful. Although at work, I'm not sure if my previous colleagues would tell you that was really annoying for them. But now I'm able to say, I'm sorry, yeah, sorry, yes, you go. Yes. So I can recognize, I was always apologizing, I suppose, but now I can recognize that that's a feature of how my brain works, that I'm jumping ahead in my thought processes. I'm interested in what they're saying, but I'm also, if I don't say this right now, I'm going to forget. And so, there's a small micro examples so I'm learning ways to communicate better about how my brain works. If someone gives me verbal instructions, it really helps me if it's in writing. So I've learned to ask, can you please put that in writing for me? Or, putting in place, different things at work that help me make sure that we're circling back to that I'm going to be reminded about the thing, or whatever it might be. And I've got my own systems in place to make sure that I'm keeping on top of all of the things that I have to do. So this is me as a leader, and the varying degrees of challenges across all neurotypes is so different. Each individual is so different. So I'm only talking about my personal experience, but for some, I've worked with hundreds of autistic people, for example, who, despite having the skills to do the job, are unable to enter the workplace because of the significant challenges that they have in that social assessment that we call an interview. The social assessment of, as soon as you walk in for an in-person interview, what is it? Smile, eye contact, shake a hand. And then it is the eye contact throughout the interview. It is selling yourself. It is probably saying things that are boasting parts of yourself that you might not otherwise feel comfortable doing. And that is not necessarily an innate skill for autistic people. Autistic people are authentic and honest. And if you ask them, perhaps about how their Excel skills and examples of previous work where they've, worked with Excel, they'll be honest. And so this social assessment is assessing your capacity to be likable, build rapport with the interviewer, and to sell yourself. And so until we shift that and disrupt the way in which we are assessing people for work, employers are missing out on the talent that lies within that population and this untapped talent pool. And so that's, for me, that barrier in itself has always driven me to do the work that we do. But now we're seeing much more of a shift in terms of understanding of every workplace is already a neurodiverse workplace. What I mean by that is that we are learning to understand that the prevalence of 1 in 5 people is across every workplace. And so therefore it is now up to the employer and the organisations to increase their understanding of neurodivergence and increase their inclusive mindset practices for their leaders. And so it's just that shift in understanding of how we can support people to stay in work.
I like that. Hey team, just popping in to say thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the episode, please take a second to like or follow the show and share it with a friend. It's the best way to help us grow and keep bringing you more great content. All right, let's get back into it. You commented earlier that Gen Z, over 50% of people in Gen Z identify with some level of neurodivergence.
Mm-hmm.
They appear to be the first generation with the full access to the screen and the social media.
Mm-hmm.
We are of a generation that has adopted it, but have the skill sets as a child to have to go play with the stick outside and deal with boredom as it is.
The good old days.
Yeah, indeed. Is there any correlation between in what you've come across? And I appreciate you're not a researcher, you're not in the medical side of it, but I find it an interesting coincidence whereby you have this cohort of a generation who over half say that they've got some attention deficit disorder or some neurodivergence in their mind, and at the same time, they've been from birth experiencing this wave of technology that creates that we're no longer waiting. That it's this, if you want a song, if you want any song you want, you can just stream it. You know, you don't have to wait for the ads to finish. You don't have to wait till 8:30 on a Thursday night to watch your TV show. You can watch the whole series now.
Right.
The idea that there is no environment to learn your ability to be patient, to hold your attention, I guess. But I just think that is that a coincidence, or is that where do we sit there with Gen Z? They're in an environment where they've not had to, it's just this instant gratification generation.
Got it. I hear what you're saying. I believe that the prevalence across all neurodivergent, has always been around 1 in 5. It's only that we are learning more about it now. And I say that because I think, once again, we know it's hereditary. And so therefore you can probably think back to your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation, and previously people who were seen as perhaps train enthusiasts, or even, words like quirky. Autism, as an example, has always been part of the human experience. It's just that we now know more. And like I said, when I started working in this space, we were really largely defining autism as a male, predominantly male condition. And that was noted by the sort of the ratios, males to females who were diagnosed. So, I think we just need to hold that I think we've always had a very neurodiverse population. We are just now knowing more. And like I said, we're expanding the criteria.
So despite the social awareness of this being prevalent in society, the diagnosis for autism have remained the same. And could it be argued, or could it be thought that the other side of the spectrum of neurodivergence is broad enough to encompass any challenging emotion of human experience, whereby you could lean on a label to be able to identify with. I just struggle with the stat that over 50% of Gen Zs identify that they aren't, they've got some difference. It almost is the opposite then. What was the other alternative? The typical. By definition, the neurotypical becomes the neurodivergent. With the majority, the typical is the difference. And so, given that the broader definition, if the diagnosis for autism has remained the same, absent of the fact that more females are opening up that journey, but yet there is a significant increase in neurodivergence generally, that makes me think then there must be an enormous amount of people being diagnosed with the, I guess, lesser, or however you want to describe it, the everything else but the autism side of things.
So, I hear what you're saying. So just, if we go back to the facts. So when I started working in this space in 2005 or so, the autism prevalence in Australia was 1 in 150. And now, 20 years or so on, it's 1 in 36 perhaps.
Okay.
So that's the prevalence, and that's what we know. And they're the people who are diagnosed. So
with autism.
Yes. And so then there is the people who self-identify, who have not yet, because we also haven't yet spoken about how it is really hard to get a diagnosis. It's expensive, there are long waiting lists, and actually it creates barriers for people to get a diagnosis. So there is a lot of people out there, an entire cohort of people who self-identify but aren't able to get a diagnosis. Or maybe it's just later on in life and they don't feel the need. They don't know what that's going to do for them. Might have already been quite accomplished in their work and they're. So therefore, 1 in 36 for autism prevalence in Australia is, that's what we know. And then there's another cohort of people who are undiagnosed. Then if we bring that back to, yes, ADHD, we're seeing an increase because largely the diagnostic criteria and our awareness in society thought of ADHD as stereotypical ADHD profile, which was, perhaps an 8-year-old boy, school-age boy, right, who can't sit still. That's kind of where most people who may not have as much knowledge might think of the stereotypical example. That is one profile, one type of, how ADHD can present. For me and for many females, inattentive ADHD can mean that the hyperactivity is not visible. It's in our brains. And so I like to describe my brain as having almost like millions of tabs open on a web browser. And each of those tabs, and you can sort of, think, oh yeah, I know what that feels like. But each of those tabs has a bouncing ball attached to it. And the bouncing ball will bounce in your brain until you've closed the tab. And, as most people do, we have millions of things that we need to do. But for a neurodivergent woman, or for myself as an ADHDer, that's where the inattentiveness comes from. That's where the lack of capacity to focus in comes from. It's not that we can't focus, but it's that there's so many distractions in our brain, I suppose, and things that are consuming us at all times. And so back to your point of, are we seeing an increase because of the environment and how we're moving and the convenient generation, I suppose. It's like everything is convenient. I guess research is yet to have a longitudinal study to see the impact of that and what the environment and how we are operating in a sort of, very much a screen-based society. I don't have any official kind of comments on that, but I do think if there is an actual diagnosis versus a self-diagnosis, because that percentage of 53% of Gen Z, 22% actually have a diagnosis, and the remainder are self-diagnosed. So with that in mind, I think as employers, as leaders, I think this is where I get passionate about the labels thing. Labels are helpful for the individual, and yes, for a leader to know what might be going on for that person, but we can't get too attached to the label, because a self-diagnosis, this is where it gets really tricky. A self-diagnosis could be, this is how I think my brain works and this is how I will learn best. That actually can really make a big difference for a lot of people. But what's important to understand is, for a neurodivergent person, that support and those adjustments that are provided in the workplace are the difference between participating in the workplace and in the workforce and not. So it is a critical difference. I hear a lot of people saying, oh, and you said before, is everyone on the spectrum? Absolutely not. I think that's quite offensive actually to many people who do have autism and have that lived experiences of the challenges that come from being autistic.
I'm not so sure. I certainly, personally, it's not coming from a place of
no
offense.
No,
it was more just to go, well, the spectrum is, by definition, is that
it's the spectrum.
One
correct.
There's a group of people that suffer significantly,
correct,
versus those who don't.
Yes.
And if we're coming from the place of everyone's brain operates differently and no one's the same, then just without any loaded prejudice, it was, well, people who don't suffer are on that end, and people who do are on that end. But you're suggesting that, or the situation is actually the spectrum is the people who suffer.
Correct. Well,
and that's not everybody.
No, actually, it comes down to one's capacity to develop skills and coping mechanisms to move through the world without too many of those challenges interfering with your capacity to operate in the community, to participate in education and in the workforce. And that's what we've got to change. So As you say, there might be some people who previously the DSM, the diagnostic criteria had you could get diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and high functioning autism. That was then removed as part of the DSM-5, and it then just became autism spectrum disorder. But that previously, I guess, is what you're saying, that there were parts of the spectrum that could help you categorize the experience for an autistic person based on those, labels, I suppose. And so, but yeah, like I said, I think actually it's more useful for us to move away from, knowing where someone sits within those sort of that, that framework or that diagnostic criteria. I actually just think we need to understand and help that person understand how their brain works. And so for a leader, that might mean asking questions like, how do you, tell me about a time when you've communicated really well, or tell me about a time when you've processed information, or when, making it really concrete, throwing back to examples of where they've done really well, because as you said before, for some people, they may not have the language or the capacity to be introspective and look at what works for them, then turn that into, this is how I need help from you as an employer. That's really challenging for many. And that could be anyone who has just got a late diagnosis to people who just, really find that hard to articulate and communicate.
So presumably with your work with organisations, Vicky, you're trying to help the leaders shift and cultivate an environment that allows the neurodivergent employee to excel.
To thrive, yeah.
Thrive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then what's your take on medication for the individual? Because going down that part, because again, so uneducated, I'll stick to my lane and be in law. I can only imagine that the medication prescribed dulls the symptoms, manages the symptoms so that the individual can better manage in day-to-day society. But if you're coming from a place of no, we think your position would be the organisation needs to do their best to create the environment that is safe, absent of the medication. What's your take on the actual on the medicine potentially prescribed to a neurodivergent human?
Good question. Once again, I'm not going to go into the medication conversation. What I am going to say, though, is that I believe that neurodivergent employees thrive when they have a toolbox of tools that they can draw from. Some of them might be supports, some of them might be adjustments, some of them might be things like medication. It is a personal choice. It is totally up to the individual. But we do know that it helps many. And so therefore, if that's a tool that you want to put in your toolbox, it allows you to then do your part to put in place or build the foundations for you to be successful in the workplace. Because I believe it's actually both responsibilities of the employer, the people leader, and the
individual.
employee. Yes, because this is where I was talking before about coping mechanisms and skills. It is important for each individual to understand their brain, and this is where I do think diagnosis is helpful. And like I said, it helped me because it helped me find the language and connect the dots on things that I thought were just me being less than, like I was comparing myself to others, and many people do. There's a high prevalence of imposter syndrome, for example, across all neurodivergence, but we're learning more about that as a consequence of being an ADHDer. So that tells me that as an ADHDer, we might walk around questioning our worth and our confidence and our capacity to do a job because we're comparing ourselves to others all the time. And for many others, it's, that puzzle piece, that label has allowed me to understand my brain, as it does for many, and it's allowed me to understand what are the things that I really need instead of the alternative before, which was I just need to work harder, to be like everyone, to work as well as everyone else, to make sure that I am adequate, that I am doing a job as well as everybody else. Whereas the whole reframe for me, and it's a personal journey, but for me, I feel lucky that I've worked in this space for a while. And so it meant that the journey of getting a diagnosis I was able to then just find the words to describe how my brain works, knowing what I need. And it's okay to ask for what I need because they are, at the end of the day, simple communication adjustments. Actually, we live in a world where we're surrounded by tools and resources, and everything is at our fingertips in regards to organizing our time, sharing information, all that sort of stuff, getting things in writing, AI, which was once called assistive technology. So assistive technology has always been around. It is a tool, it is software, it is supports that allow people with disability and neurodivergent individuals to access education and access the workplace. And now it is more universally adopted. And I love that reframe because for so long, note-taking, for example, having a note-taking assistant was an adjustment that was required, but it was previously seen as assistive technology. Whereas now we're just seeing that everybody really benefits from having, perhaps a note-taking assistant or the transcription that comes from your online meeting. That is universal design. Back to your question, I go on big tangents. So back to your question, I now know what tools help me. I now know that there's small changes that I can make in my habits and my practice. And I now know the stuff that I significantly struggle with that I need help with. And one of them is like attention to detail, for example. I know that is not a strength of mine. And so I use the incredible brains of the people around me and ask for assistance in terms of checking work and things like that. I just feel more confident in my capacity to ask for the things that I need. And that's, once again, coming from a person who's been in this space for a while and advocates for this all the time. But for many others, it's going to take more work in terms of developing that toolbox of supports and things that you need. And actually, for many, like I said, the journey of getting the diagnosis was a really positive one, a bit of processing, but overall really positive. For many, it's not. It's actually really a complete disruption to the identity that you thought you had for so long, for however many years you've been on this earth.
And to be fair, I apologize because I did assume that would be an uplifting, or at least what did I say? I think relief. There'd be a sense of relief as a result of that. But you're right. It could also be the negative.
Yes, it could be total relief. That explains everything. And for me, that's a good word to use. Huge amount of relief. But for many, it is a complete pulling back and shedding of your entire identity and everything you thought to be who you are and starting again. And that's a really jarring experience for many and one that takes a long time. So that's when I say, it's up to a people leader to have that conversation and for the person to say what they need. It could take a long time to get there.
With all your inspiring work you're doing with organizations, with companies, where would you like to see us see that in 10 years' time? Where does that look? What's the goal?
I believe the goal is universal design. So we know that what is good for a neurodivergent person is good for everybody. The work from home example is a really great one. Like I said, work from home is a really great adjustment, but actually it's just a way of working that works well for many. The world of work needs to shift to be more individual focused and less cohort, less like built on processes and foundations that have been around for a long time and more just based on the individual. Because I can guarantee that all those folks that were trying to get work from home as an adjustment all those years ago, if they just felt listened to and heard, would have not only thrived within their work, but done an exceptional job, and definitely more of an exceptional job than perhaps their counterparts because of the incredible brain and skills and unique talents that come from being neurodivergent. It's those small adjustments that allow that person to perform and allow that person to participate, but also allows that person to bring their incredible skills and values to the workplace. And so where we want to get to is removing assumptions, removing expectations about what you think a person needs based on your experience of being a human or your experience of being a manager or your experience of working in, being a hiring manager and moving through the recruitment process. I think if we can learn to ask the person, there's a really great acronym which I refer to quite a lot, which was coined by Randy Lewis, which is ATP, which means just ask the person. And if it was that simple, then everyone has a chance to have a voice. That's one thing we need to get to, whereas we're listening to the individual and trying to make adjustments where possible, because in the world of work, like I said before, there's a lot of barriers. So the work from home is a great example. The 9 to 5 construct, I don't know where that came from actually, but suddenly we're all working in this sort of 9 to 5 way. But one thing that's important to understand is that can also be a significant barrier for some neurodivergent individuals. ADHD is the prevalence of any sort of sleep-related challenges or problems within the ADHD population is significant. The studies are all varying, but it's somewhere between a third and up. So depending on where you look, the statistic changes, but it's way more than the neurotypical population is what I'm saying. So sleep apnea, sleep insomnia, restless leg syndrome, it is, the research is clear. And so therefore, are we setting people up to fail if the standard system expectation is that we turn up at 9 and that person has not been able to fall asleep or has had trouble sleeping? Or is there small shifts that we can make in our thinking as a leader or as an employer to shift what is the standard expectation? Because I've seen it happen time and time again where the leader just says, oh, well, of course, do you want to start at 10 and work 10 till 6? Would that work better for you? And instead of saying, let's, help you get a better routine at home, because without a doubt that person has worked very hard to get that right and tried all the things. But it just takes the leader being a little bit more supportive and empathetic and saying, let's just shift that. That's fine, because you can still do your work in those hours. And so therefore, I've seen that happen many times, and that person then thrives and adds incredible value and stays in that job. And, that's where we need to get to, where it's pushing past what is the systemic challenges. And as an individual, as a leader, you can make small changes every day. Little changes make a big difference. And looking at what the individual needs. It also means looking at the environment, which I think we're getting better at. There's more understanding about the impact of the environment, and we see that in most workplaces now, where there's various ways in which you can work. So there's standing desks, great example of universal design. There's various places you can sit. And so we're getting better at that, I think, and that's very supportive to many neurodivergent individuals. But there's also something that we have called the optimum job design, which is taking into account the well-being and psychological safety of the person to ensure that the job is designed in a way that is supporting them to feel psychologically safe. So the workplace as a whole, obviously, we need to be operating in a psychologically safe way. The environment, and then, of course, the people leader needs to be operating in a psychologically safe way, which is everything that we deliver in our training and education is about being psychologically safe. The strongest indicator of the success of a neurodivergent person is psychological safety, and a people leader being psychologically, So optimum job design looks at those aspects to ensure that the jobs are designed in a way that supports that. And is that good for just a neurodivergent person, or is that good for everyone? It's good for everyone. So we believe that if we just think about universal design, think about psychological safety, and be less bound by the ways in which we've always done things, and start to inform shifts in processes, practices, policies to be more neuroinclusive, we know that's going to support everybody to thrive.
Vicky, thank you so much for your time. I've learned a great deal. And I think the greatest takeaway is to be able to, not only ask the person, but to lean into this idea that what is good for a neurodivergent person is effectively good for everybody. So lean into that. Mm-hmm. Final 5 questions before you go. We ask everyone, what does success mean to you?
I love these questions. For me, success is driven by being authentic. That's something I value, but also meaningful work. I'm really, really lucky, and I thank my lucky stars every day that I'm in a industry, in a job that I love, because that drives, my vision for success, which is to be able to make an impact, to be able to create some change to the world, to leave the world a better place than when, I got here, and to make a better world for my children and the next generation. And so that for me is my driving force. But that doesn't have to be big systemic change. It can mean small changes. I'm actually really, I feel like success can come from micro moments, micro successes. So, it may not be an ultra triathlon, but it might be for a person who has had an injury and it's, walking 5 meters, and that's a success. And I think in our society we celebrate success in such a way that it could be these big monumental life stages that we achieve, or experiences of being a human, whatever that might be. It's different for everybody. But for me personally, it's those doing meaningful work, being authentic, and making sure that we're celebrating those micro moments of success, the small goals, the small wins. And I just want to say as well, for autistic people, for neurodivergent people, I've heard success to them, for example, is being able to participate in the workforce and pay taxes like everybody else. That is success. So I think success needs to be recognised as it is, I think, more so as an individual thing, and those goals can be small or they can be big.
What does happiness mean to you?
Happiness means to me, yes, happiness to me is what makes your heart sing, and finding that and doing that. So it could be, once again, aligned to your values. So for me, it is celebrating the micro moments. It is the family is a huge value of mine. Family, friends, human connection. It is sunshine, it is the ocean, it is music, it is, all those things that I value. So I find happiness in those micro moments. I find gratitude is a huge part of happiness, and actually not missing those micro moments. So it could be for me just enjoying those small moments in the kitchen with my children, for example. Not the huge global trips to Europe or whatever, although that's, they're memories that need to be made, but happiness can be found in the gratitude of those micro moments. And so, I think it's once again, not skipping past and looking towards that huge goal, but it's enjoying those moments. Yeah. So for me, it could be on a sunny day, I feel really happy. I could be happy if I'm in the ocean. I could be happy if I'm just with my kids and, enjoying watching them be happy, or even just enjoying watching them sleep. There's so much joy that comes from being a mum to my children. That's happiness to me. And it doesn't have to be that I take them on a trip to Europe or that we do some monumental thing. It's just those micro moments.
What does your normal morning routine look like?
I love this question because I'm totally going to shatter the concept that all people should have an incredible morning to make the day successful. I get that is true for many. But like I said, if we go back to what I said before about ADHD and having sleep disruptions, challenges, I don't have great sleep patterns. And so my morning, in all honesty, is coffee. And I have young children.
What time do you wake up? It varies, or?
It varies, It depends on the kids. Yeah. So, for the most part, it's sort of in the 7:30 range. And it is just getting through the morning with young children, school-aged children, who, it can be chaotic. It can be loud. We are a loud family. And so to me, the morning isn't the early rise. So, sometimes there's exercise. Sometimes it's just getting some sunshine. But it is not that stereotypical doing all the things that are going to, if you make the morning, you make the day kind of concept. I actually just find that my time to shine is mid-morning and onwards. And actually, many ADHDers come alive at night. And so in building a business recently, I've noticed that I have these magic hours after the kids go to bed, and that's my time. So I think, once again, if we move past these misconceptions and assumptions that everybody should be operating in the same way, especially for a neurodivergent individual.
And what would be one piece of advice you'd give to the world?
I think at the end of the day, it's just really important to be a good human. And so what does that mean? Be kind, be authentic, and be empathetic. And don't make assumptions. I think it takes practice for us to release our expectations of how everyone should be operating. And if you lean into the human, that allows you to be human-centered in the way that you move through the world. It allows then people, those humans that you're working with, in your family, to be authentically themselves. And at the end of the day, they're the micro moments and the small changes that you can make on somebody that can make a big difference to them. So, yeah, I think it's just about practicing the art of being a good human every day.
And then finally, somebody that you know who you think would be a great guest for the show?
So I have an incredible stepmom. I'm very lucky. Her name is Suzanne Colbert, and she started a company decades ago called the Australian Network on Disability, which is now known as the Australian Disability Network. She's actually, honestly, one of the original advocates who saw a need to work with organisations to create change for people with disability, as opposed to working with the individuals to help them develop skills for the workplace. Like I said, both are important. There's a lot of organisations and services delivering supports and services to people with disability to find work and neurodivergent individuals, but really where the change needs to happen, as you can hear from what I've said, is in the education and awareness of the organisation. So, yeah, she's an incredible woman. She's one of the most incredible minds, and I think she could really add value to this kind of topic and, deepen the level of understanding in terms of what workplaces need to do.
So good. That'd be an amazing opportunity. Vicky, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you're not here for a long time on the coast, but I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat, and I've learned so much. And just keep doing the work you're doing.
Thank you.
It's obviously so needed, and as you said, the more we can be more inclusive and more aware, more educated, the better it is for everyone. So thank you so much, mate.
Thank you for your time.
That was another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. Next time you're interrupting someone, turn to the other person next to you and tell them all about the show. It really means a lot. Huge thank you to Vicky for sharing her powerful insights and personal journey with such honesty and clarity. If today's conversation inspired you to lead with more empathy and awareness, please subscribe, leave a comment, or share it with someone who needs to hear it. It really does make a difference. Until next time, peace.